let's get started. If any one of you who uses Zoom knows how to make that silly thing turn her voice off, I'd like to know. That's a new feature of the current iteration, and I find it extremely annoying. So if you know how to turn that off, I'd like to know. If you are online, feel free to turn your camera on. If you'd rather hide in the dark, that's fine. If you need to speak or you want to speak, most of you are currently muted. If you're using a computer, just hit the space bar and that will unmute you as long as you hold the space bar down, I think, or maybe it's tap it and tap it again to remute. Feel free to speak up, feel free to ask questions. Now tonight, what we're going to do is go over the class requirements, course requirements. I'll show you a few resources and a few other things that you might find helpful. And then we will be doing a very rapid sort of a survey overview tonight of Old Testament history leading up to the time that we're actually going to be looking at. If you look into the syllabus, you'll see that the first class tonight is an introduction to the history and the geography of Kings and Chronicles with sort of a synopsis of their political history and a record of the time, basically from conquest when they came into the land of promise until the time of King David. So we'll get just a quick look at the reign of King Saul, and we'll deal more with that a little bit next week. So these first 2 weeks will be, in some respects, a lot of review. If you have taken the Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel classes, we'll be looking at a few of those things the first couple of weeks. Now, two kinds of students in this course: credit students and audit students. If you are auditing the class, what that means is you have no assignments and you have no responsibilities beyond whatever you put on yourself to show up. If as an audit student, you want to take the tests, you're welcome to do that, and I'll grade them. If as an audit student, you want to write a research paper, I'll be happy to read it and grade it. If you want to do the sermon outlines now, and if you may discover comparing notes with Sister Rosalind, who's in this class at Piedmont, there are a couple of more class requirements for this iteration than there are for that one. That's because I accidentally left them out of the other one. So there are some sermon outlines associated with this. Short, brief, not difficult. If you want to write some of those, I'll be happy to look them over and give you a grade on them. But if you register as an audit student and you stay as an audit student and you do all of those things, you'll get a grade, but you'll have to take it up with Brother Rick and Brother David Decker as to whether or not you actually get credit for it. So that being said, if you're taking the class for credit, and I know at least a couple are, you need to understand two major tests, a midterm and a final. We will be covering 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So you will be tested over all the material there, but not necessarily in that order, because these books are not chronological in their arrangement. There is a research paper required for credit in this class, and I'm going to talk about writing research papers in just a minute. And you've got a handout. If you're online, you should have a handout attached to the email that I sent you with the link for this class called A Guide to Writing Research Papers. Now, that's not anything very formal in itself, but that gives you a good general understanding of what's involved. And we'll talk about that a little more. This, and you can see it has a huge title all over the front of it. This is a book that is now out of print. It's available on eBay. It's available in used bookstores from used booksellers. It's a very helpful book, but it's not a required book. It's called A Harmony of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. It's an older book by a gentleman named William Day Crockett, like daytime. And like I say, it's readily available on eBay. You can get a copy of it, a newly printed copy, on Amazon. It's about $18 or $20 on Amazon. And that what they've done, somebody has taken it and scanned it because it is in the public domain, and then they have reprinted it and made it available. If you want to buy a brand new copy, if you got 20 bucks, go to Amazon, you'll find it there. All the information about this book and all the others that I have suggested as resources are in the syllabus. The other books are over here on the table. The Tyndall Old Testament Commentary Series, the Burton Kaufman Commentary Series, and the, what is this one? Focus on the Bible series. They're all referenced in the syllabus. Those of you who are here in person, you're welcome to come take a look at them if you want to at the break, and we'll take a break in a little over an hour. Those are simply good references. None of these books is required for the class. Now, let's talk about research papers. I want to talk about this right off the bat because many of the students who do take these classes for credit are not folks that have a lot of college experience, a lot of college background. And so it's necessary to kind of explain what a manuscript or research paper is and what it's not. And the simplest way to explain this is a research paper, a term paper, sometimes you're called that, is not a sermon. It's not a written sermon. It's not meant for you to try to persuade me of something. It's not an editorial where you read about some subject and just express your opinion about it. Now, some of your opinion may be in it, and that's fine, but it's not just an editorial. It's a scholarly research paper. It's where you go and find credible academic resources and study on a given subject, and then you put together what you learned. The whole point of a research paper is to show the teacher what you learned about this particular subject. There is a proper format for research papers. It's not just scribbled out, written willy-nilly. You have to document where your information comes from, what books or what resources you got the information from. And there's a proper way, in fact, there's several proper ways to do that. And those are referenced in this little document, Writing Manuscripts and Research Papers. All of this information is in that handout. I'm not going to beat this to death, but just if you flip over to page 4 in that little handout, there's also some information you might find helpful, and that is you need to organize your information so that it makes sense. If you study something that's interesting to you, study a question, study a subject, research something that is interesting to you, you'll have an easier time of doing this because you'll be interested in what you're reading about. When it comes to actually writing a research paper, don't start with the introduction. The introduction is the hardest part of the paper to write. Start with the body of the paper. There are 3 basic parts to a research paper. There's an introduction, there's the body of the paper, and then there's the summary or the conclusion. What did you learn? Start in the middle. Start with the body of it. Here's all of the information that I looked at. Here's what I discovered about this, about this, about this, about this, and this is where it leads me. This is the conclusion. When you've written the body of the paper and the conclusion, then you can go back and write the introduction, because the introduction is just a synopsis of everything that you're about to explain. It helps to organize your information, to organize it for clarity. Not everything that relates to a subject is relevant to that subject. Oh, here's Corinna Sylvester. There's some information here about typical reference works you might consult for information, and I'm not gonna go into those. There you can read as well as I can. Write clearly write in complete sentences, write for positive impact. The biggest mistake most students make in trying to write a research paper is that they don't sit down and read what they just wrote. When you sit down and write a research paper, before you do anything else with it, before you even bother to put all the documentation into it, print it out, or if you handwrite it, just put all the pages in order and read it out loud. Word for word, read it out loud to yourself so that you have to hear. Don't read it silently, read out loud so that you have to hear what it sounds like, because you're not going to get halfway through the first page before you're making corrections and rewording things. And once you've read it all the way through out loud and made all those changes and corrections, go back and rewrite it or retype it. And that's what you'll want to then turn in. Most people won't read an article over about 2 paragraphs. If you can't stand to read what you write, imagine what it's like for anybody else. Now, try to express yourself clearly. There are some resources on the last page here about how to document what you write. There are 3 basic documentation schools that you run across. Most colleges now have gone from the Chicago Manual of Style, or what we used to call Turabian, which is named for Catherine or Kate Turabian, who first publicized it. Most colleges now have discarded Turabian in favor of either the MLA, Modern Language Association, or the APA, American Psychiatric Association method of documenting. And there's information on all 3 of those in this handout, and I'm not going to belabor that point. Pick one. I don't care which one you use. I learned Turabian. I like Turabian. It's the most thorough in my judgment. If you want to use MLA or APA, that's fine. Now, if you go using Society of Biblical Literature, you better tell me. Because if you've learned that, I want to talk to you. But that's, I'm kidding a little bit about that, but not really. Okay, let's talk about the background of these books that we're going to be looking at. And these books in our Bibles appear 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Really, if we were going to put these in, if we're going to title these things logically, as in the Hebrew Old Testament, they would be all 1st and 2nd Samuel, Kings, and 1st and 2nd Kings would be 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's usually the way they are considered, except in the Old Testament, guess what? 1st and 2nd Samuel are not 1st and 2nd Samuel. They're Samuel, one book. 1st and 2nd Kings the same way, Chronicles the same way. They weren't divided as we see it until they were translated into Greek during the intertestamental period. And the simple explanation, the logical explanation for why they then became part A and part B was because that's how much would fit on a typical scroll. About half of this, about half of that. So you have Samuel A and Samuel B, Kings A and Kings B, except they didn't call them Kings and Chronicles. They had Kings and Kings and Kings and Kings. Well, when you look at 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, you might think, why do we have a duplicate here? Except you start in 1 Kings chapter 1 and compare that with 1 Chronicles chapter 1. Guess what? They don't line up, do they? In fact, if you want to take the events in chronological order, where do you go? You start in 1 Chronicles, and that's where we'll devote the time tonight and next week. But the background to that is, what are the purposes of these books? When you look at 1st and 2nd Kings, you have a history of the kingdom from the time of Saul, basically. Take your Bible, flip over to 1 Kings chapter 1 and verse 1. And where are we as we start 1 Kings chapter 1? Well, 1 Kings just follows right on with the death of David. Where did we leave David? 2 Samuel. Who was before David? That was King Saul. That's over in 2 Samuel. But you flip over to 1 Chronicles, and where does 1 Chronicles begin? Chronicles begins with Adam and comes much like Luke in his genealogy of the Savior, all the way down to the contemporary kings, through the patriarchs, through the judges, through the time of slavery and wilderness wanderings and conquest, the upheaval of the judges and so forth. What's the explanation for the difference? Why are there two records like this? We might as well ask, why do you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John?
I've always heard that the Chronicles was the spiritual, kind of spiritual life, or a view from the priest's view, and Kings was a view from the king's view.
Okay. Luann says that what she's always heard is that the Chronicles are the priestly presentation, and 1st and 2nd Kings are sort of the historical or the royal record. And there's probably something to that in one sense. Go ahead, Cherie. Okay. In 1st and 2nd Kings, what do we have? As we survey through that, we're going to be looking at both sides of the kingdom. After all, when we start in 1 Kings, where do we start? Basically with the death of David and what happens when David dies, or actually before David dies. Solomon becomes king. We have the internecine warfare that's not over yet among David's heirs. And so Solomon becomes king. Pardon me just a minute. Jim O'Brien, I can see you speaking, and I can't tell if you're speaking to me or if you're speaking to somebody there. Okay. All right, good deal.
I got Sharon here with me.
Oh, okay. Well, I know usually y'all are in different rooms, so that's that's why I wasn't sure. Okay. We start with Solomon basically in 1 Kings. And as we go through 1st and 2nd Kings, we're going to be looking at both sides of the kingdom, because what happens as soon as Solomon dies to his united kingdom? Solomon is going to expand the kingdom to its greatest territorial and material and political range that it will ever achieve. He'll cover more territory, rule more people, rake in more wealth, influence more neighboring kingdoms than his father David ever did. But what happens as soon as Solomon dies? The kingdom splits. So we have in Saul, David, and Solomon what's called the United Kingdom. Has nothing to do with England, Ireland, Wales, and Scotland. And from Rehoboam and Jeroboam onward, we have the divided kingdom. And that's going to last for several centuries. The divided kingdom, 10 tribes to the north, 1 tribe and a smidgen of Benjamin counted with them to the south. Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, shows us these two side by side, a parallel view basically. What's going on in the north, what's going on in the south. One of the things that you'll find as we go along that can be a little bit confusing, some of these kings, both north and south, share the same name. Thankfully, not exactly at the same time. Also, you'll find that there are kings who have the same name within the kingdom. Jeroboam, who taught Israel to sin, is the founding king of the northern or 10 tribes kingdom known as Israel after the division. But guess what? Generations later down the road in Israel, Along comes another Jeroboam. They're not the same individual. And we need to remember that. And sometimes we find kings called by different names. You have Jehoram and Joram, between different descriptions between Kings and Chronicles. You'll find Hiram, the king of Tyre, who supplies the skilled craftsmen and the building materials for Solomon to build the temple and for him to build his own magnificent palace. But over in Chronicles, he's not Hiram at all. He's Huram. Well, we're talking about the same person, but the names are slightly different. So it's helpful to understand that. But let's talk about Chronicles for a minute. First and Second Chronicles. When you're talking about First and Second Chronicles now, what we're looking at is primarily focused. It does make mention of the northern kingdom of Israel, but the primary focus from the beginning of First Chronicles to the end, basically from Adam to Zechariah, is Judah, the southern kingdom. That's that, in a sense, that priestly focus, because what's going to be the single most distinguishing difference once the kingdom divides, the single most distinguishing difference between the northern and the southern kingdoms? Okay, the temple's in Jerusalem where the priests are, you're right. The kings in Judah, number one, the kings in Judah are one continuous lineage, whereas the kings in Israel, in the northern kingdom, are family after family after family after family. This one kills that one, this one kills that one, this one kills that one. So they're not even, many of them not even related to each other. But if you want to describe the difference between the two kingdoms in a single word, that word surely is religion. Because even though the kingdom of Judah, the southern kingdom, was nominally faithful to God, they weren't faithful to God. The northern kingdom, under Jeroboam the first, wholesale turned their back on righteous religion, on godliness, and embraced idolatry. In fact, when we get to Jeroboam, what's one of the very first things he does? He creates his own religion out of whole cloth and says to his people, it's too much trouble for you to go to Jerusalem to worship. So here I built you a temple at Dan and I built you a temple at Bethel. Just go here and worship. Oh, and by the way, you want to be a priest and you're not a Levite? No problem. You can be a priest in my religion. But then, as if to add insult to injury, to pour salt into the wound or to multiply the offense, when he does set up that golden calf at Dan and that golden calf at Bethel, what words does he use in inaugurating this new false religion? Behold, your gods, plural, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. He gives credit to homemade idols, figments of his own imagination, for what the God of heaven had done for his people. So that's just a little salt in the wound of him turning his back on God. We'll talk about that more as we go along. Why, though, come back to where we were a minute ago. Why would we have two sort of parallel accounts?
How the writer saw it? Is it how?
Okay, well, there's a little bit of how the writer saw it, but remember, who's the author in both cases? Holy Spirit. But what we have here are accounts that reinforce one another. They're independent of each other. When were these books written? Anybody know? Rough guess? First and Second Kings follows First and Second Samuel. And although the books are anonymous as far as crediting a specific writer, we can flip over to the book of Philippians in the New Testament. And what do we find? The Apostle Paul to the church that is at Philippi with the bishops and deacons. So we know who the inspired penman was for the book of Philippians or Ephesians or Colossians or Corinthians or Romans. In fact, how many anonymous books are there in the New Testament? But basically the book of Hebrews is the only anonymous book, and most folks think Paul wrote that, although there are a few that hold out for Barnabas or Apollos or somebody like that. Doesn't matter. The Holy Spirit is the inspired penman. In the Old Testament, you have several anonymous books, Kings and Chronicles among them. Now, there are a number of suggestions for who wrote the books of Kings and Chronicles, and some folks hold really strong opinions on the subject. Scholarship is divided about the human writer of First and Second Kings, for example. There are parts of First and Second Kings that could very well, just looking at the style, could very well have come from the pen of David, the poet, or Solomon, the wise, or perhaps Hezekiah, who was wise in his own right. Some suggest that they could have. There is a Talmudic tradition, that is, the tradition among ancient Jews is that Jeremiah is the inspired writer of First and Second Kings, and that you could certainly make a case for that because Jeremiah lived through a lot of these events. Jeremiah was a man who was schooled in the history of his people. Jeremiah was a man who had the opportunity to record these things. And given the times in which he lived, he certainly would have had the inspired motive. Jeremiah lives through the reigns of 4 kings and a governor before the city is demolished. During the reigns of those 4 kings, 3 of the 4 were evil, wicked, unrighteous men: Jehoiachin, Jehoiakim, and Zedekiah. Only Josiah of those kings was a righteous man. Only during Josiah's reign was Jeremiah even welcome in the palace. It would stand to reason, since Josiah was very intent on trying to turn the nation around and turn back to God, it would stand to reason that perhaps Jeremiah would write these things down as a textbook, in a manner of speaking, for his own people. What's the character of these 4 books? What kind of books are they? History. They're history books. How many of you enjoyed history when you were in high school? I did not enjoy history when I was a freshman because of the teacher who taught the class. The teacher who taught the class was in her 30th year of teaching, and it was very obvious that the lesson plans and the assignments and the information that she was presenting to us, she had worked and slaved over 30 years ago, and she had not touched it since that time, and she was not interested in it. She was counting time until she could retire, and she resented us being in her way. It was not an interesting class. Anybody remember the Teapot Dome scandal in American history? What was it about? Standard Oil. At the turn of the century, 19th to 20th centuries, Standard Oil exploring for oil in the Teapot Dome, which was actually an area in Montana, if memory serves me, or perhaps the Dakotas or Wyoming, an area where they were exploring for oil and were accused of monopolistic practices and so forth. Why would I remember that? Only because I had to put it on a test, and it stuck with me because I thought it was an odd name. How does it affect my life today? A really well-versed historian and economist might be able to point out how that was part of trust-busting history, and that corporate things changed in those days because of that. But in practical terms, Benji, that doesn't have a lot of effect on me, does it? And I don't have any burning need to know the details of the Teapot Dome scandal. The next year, my history teacher in high school was the baseball coach, a little Oklahoma man about this tall named Tommy Darter. And I went into that class expecting, oh, great, another coach teaching history. It was fascinating. I ate it up because not only did he love history, but he didn't express it this way, but he taught me what history is. What is history?
A series of biographies.
Okay, history is the story of people. It's a series of biographies of the lives of people. And when we look at the lives of people, what are we looking at? We're looking at folks like us. So we look at 1 Kings, 2 Kings, we have this parallel of the two kingdoms. We see right off the bat, as soon as they divide, wow, what a profound difference between the two. And then we see just how far in Israel they can go trying to get away from God. And we see in Judah just how stupid God's people can be playing footsie with the ungodly people. And we go generation by generation, and we're introduced to these people. Now, the Talmudic tradition, Jeremiah wrote these books, is not certain, but it has a lot to recommend it, and it stands to reason. The time that's covered in this period is about 400 years, roughly. The kings, the name of these books, kings or kingdoms in older translations, refers to the rulers whose lives are being narrated here. Some suggest that Ezra was the author, but I believe a better case is made for Ezra to be the author, the inspired writer of Chronicles than for 1st and 2nd Kings, because of the focus on Judah. Now, look at 1st and 2nd Chronicles for a minute. What's a chronicle? A chronicle is simply a record of events. These books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles in the Hebrew Bible were originally called the words or the records of days. We might simply say history. That's the idea here. And in the Septuagint book, Septuagint translation, Septuagint Old Testament, they're described as the books of omissions or things omitted. Well, what was omitted? You have a lot of information in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, a lot of details that aren't in 1st and 2nd Kings. Now, the name Chronicles was actually given post church establishment in the AD period by the scholar Jerome. Jewish tradition says that these books were compiled by Ezra. All right, let's think about this. When did Ezra live? Let's look at our Hebrew history for a minute. If someone contemporary to the kings wrote the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, for argument's sake, let's say if the Talmudic tradition is true and it was Jeremiah, when were the books of 1st and 2nd Kings written? Well, they'd have been written somewhere at the end of the 7th century, the beginning of the 6th century BC, somewhere in the late 600s down into the early 500s, from let's say 610 down to about 580 BC. Remember, on the BC side, all the numbers go backwards. If they're contemporary with the kings. When does Judah wind up being conquered and going into captivity in Babylon? Yeah, right there in that same time frame. The initial conquest takes place in 606 BC. That's when Daniel is scooped up along with Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, taken into captivity and trained to be a Babylonian bureaucrat. Ezekiel, the priest and prophet, is deported, let's say, in the next great wave of conquest, which takes place about 9 years later, about 597 BC. But the end comes when the army actually comes in and demolishes Jerusalem, tears down the walls, obliterates the temple in 586 BC. That's when, from that point on, according to Jeremiah, there will never, ever, ever, Jeremiah chapter 22, be a son of David who will prosper as a king in Jerusalem, sitting on his father's throne. That's important because that gets to the heart of millennialist theory, premillennial dispensational theology that most of the Protestant world is just eaten up with nowadays. That's one of the reasons. We look at these things and say this doesn't have any bearing on our lives in the 21st century. In 1975, I think it was, at Camp David, Maryland, Jimmy Carter stood with Menachem Begin on one side and Yasser Arafat on the other side, and shook hands with the two of them, and then they shook hands with each other, sworn mortal enemies that had fought each other for years, an Israeli and an Arab, a Jew and a Muslim, and they made peace, the Camp David Peace Accords. What prompted that whole effort? I'll tell you this, it wasn't politics. It was President Carter's theology. President Carter is a Baptist of some variety, and he is a dispensational premillennialist in his theology. That means that he believes, A, that land belongs specifically to the nation of Israel in perpetuity. Number two, that Judaism is an alternative way of salvation for Jews. They don't have to become Christians in order to be saved. But number three, that if he could broker peace between Begin and Arafat, then that would push things forward in his misinterpretation of Daniel's timetable and Jesus' words in Matthew 24 toward what he understands to be the coming of the king to reign on a throne, King Jesus, to reign on a throne in Jerusalem for 1,000 years, the millennium. There's a fly in that ointment. That's not what Daniel was talking about. That's not what Jesus was talking about. Jeremiah invalidates that whole concept by pointing out that God himself said that no descendant of David would ever prosper on his father's throne in the city of Jerusalem. Jesus cannot reign over a millennial kingdom in this world unless Jeremiah, and by implication the Holy Spirit, is a liar or is wrong. Well, these things bear on us. So we come back over here to 1st and 2nd Chronicles, or the omissions, the things that were not put into the record of the kings. And as we read 1st and 2nd Chronicles, well, good night, this goes all the way back to Adam. And this carries us all the way down through Zedekiah and the destruction. And it sets the stage for restoration of what? In Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. You know, this is the third of 4 semesters of what used to be described in our catalog as Hebrew history. Joshua, Judges, and Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, Kings and Chronicles, and then Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Chronicles sets the stage for Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And what do Ezra and Nehemiah record?
After the period after Esther, Esther's in front of them. She's in the
Okay.
captivity. They're behind it.
They're- They are to a degree contemporaneous, partly. But Ezra and Nehemiah record God fulfilling the promise that Jeremiah had emphasized all that time back, and Ezekiel and Daniel, that God would restore his people to their territory, and they would rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild a temple. It would never be like Solomon's until Herod came along in the end of the 1st century BC. And then it probably in some ways surpassed Solomon's, though not for wealth. Chronicles, where 1st and 2nd Kings is simply a record of the kings, both kingdoms, Chronicles takes us from Adam to the restoration of the kingdom, with a focus not on Israel, the 12 tribes, but specifically on Judah, the presumably righteous tribe. They weren't always righteous. I say presumably because they weren't always righteous, even after the restoration. But they never again fell into the kind of idolatry that the northern kingdom had embraced. Now, there are a couple of points, a couple of things that stand out in Chronicles that are less obvious in Kings. Number one, Chronicles, getting to what Luann said a while ago about this being the priestly record, there's more emphasis on religion in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. There is a religious purpose in this history. It's showing the legitimacy of the Davidic line all through this, how that this traces back to God's earliest promises for his purpose. It emphasizes how God takes care of his people. It gives a lot of prominence to the building of the temple, which is, of course, the representation of God's presence among his people. You see much more information, much more detail in Chronicles than you do in Kings about how men like Hezekiah and Josiah and others who were righteous tried to purge the land of idolatry, tried to destroy idols and get rid of that influence. There's only a slight mention of the northern kingdom of Israel from time to time when it's necessary in the books of Chronicles, where in the books of Kings, you bounce back and forth. This is going on here, this is going on here, this is going on here, this is going on here. These two come together for this, and this is the result of it. But in Chronicles, it's all basically God's people who are nominally faithful to him. So, a couple of messages or lessons that would stand out in the books of Chronicles that would be less obvious, let's say, in the books of Kings. Number one, if you want your nation to endure, you better take God into account. 1st and 2nd Chronicles brings us back to that again and again. Take God into account. Number two, in 1st and 2nd Kings, in the book of Jeremiah, as Jeremiah is chronicling his work as a prophet, what's one of the things that stands out with every prophet that speaks to the north? Isaiah speaks to the northern kingdom about 750 BC. Jeremiah speaks to the southern kingdom about 600 BC. They have basically the same experience, even though they're separated by 150 years, and they're speaking to two different audiences. The message is the same. The individual that worships God is the true patriot in a nation like Judah. in a nation like Israel. In the northern kingdom, we look at this, we say Jeroboam taught Israel to sin. He introduced idolatry. They turned away. They didn't go to Jerusalem anymore. And that's largely true. But let's not paint with too broad a brush, because even in the north, there were prophets for God. Even in the north, there were individuals in Israel who were faithful to God. May have been few and far between much of the time, but there were some. Think about what it would be like to be faithful to the God of your ancestors, who is the God, the only real God, in a nation that has turned completely away. We come into the 21st century in the United States, and you are a practicing, open, vocal Christian. What is your employer maybe apt to request of you and then maybe insist? Keep your religion to yourself. The workplace is no place for your religion. Wait a minute. My faith is what makes me a better employee for you. Well, that's fine, but keep it to yourself. You don't want your other employees to be better employees? Just hush. How about the marketplace of ideas in the 21st century? How many of our 50 states, or how many of the Canadian provinces, or how many of the 29 states of Mexico could an individual run for public political office and advertise their faith and have it be considered an asset and not a black mark against them? Now, we have the privilege here of living in the South, and our state politicians, both parties, make it a point to emphasize at various times, they're religious in one way or another. In fact, one of our federal senators is a pastor in the Baptist church, Senator Warnock. That's considered an asset in this part of the country. Go to some of our other states, go into much of Canada, go to some states in Mexico, that would just about get you disqualified. The person who worships God, the person who's faithful to God, is the genuine patriot, because the person who's faithful to God is ultimately the best influence in the nation that the rulers could hope for. Communism, socialism, fascism, all those isms that seek to control people from the top down, any kind of authoritarianism, whatever the variety of it, never fails to overlook the fact that a faithful, practicing Christian, or in ancient times, a faithful, practicing Jew, would be the best citizen that ruler could hope for. Because as long as that individual is not required to violate their faith, what are they required by God to do? I'm supposed to obey the laws of men. I'm supposed to obey the civil authorities. I'm supposed to respect them. I'm supposed to build up the nation where I am and be a good influence. Those forms of government, authoritarianism, always fails to see that, because all it can see is, I, the ruler, must be your God. I must be your source of everything. And any other source, any competition will not be tolerated. Well, this is the kind of environment, in some respects, that these ancient people had to deal with. And these are some of the lessons that these books are designed, Chronicles particularly, are designed to emphasize. Now, in this, Kings versus Chronicles, you have a cross-referencing of a lot of information in much the same way we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's often said, and I don't know that there's concrete proof of it, but it certainly makes sense, that Matthew appears to have been written primarily for a Jewish readership, Mark primarily for a Roman readership, Luke for a more scholarly Greek group of readers, and John, somewhere between 30 and 60 years later, primarily for Christians. And John is the odd man out in that his presentation of the Christ doesn't parallel Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Why do we need 4 different views or 4 different presentations of the Savior? Different perspective.
Like you said, with this, to reinforce each-
They reinforce each other. You know, Matthew shows us Jesus fulfilling prophecy after prophecy after prophecy after prophecy. What does Mark show us? Mark shows us Jesus as a man of action. Immediately he went here. Straightway he said that. Over and over and over again. He was a busy, busy guy in this world. Luke shows us the intellectual Jesus in a sense. The ideal man. The perfect man in every way. The one that you'd want to follow and be like. And then John shows us, of course, the Savior who has bought us with his own blood. Now, the Chronicles, I said Kings, a little while ago I said Kings appear to have been written contemporaneously, or at least during the closing years of the kingdom leading up to the destruction. The Chronicles, by all appearances, were written after captivity. So you've got roughly 100 years or maybe a little more between the writing of Kings and the writing of Chronicles. And you have, like I said, detail in the Chronicles pertaining to Judah that does not appear in the Kings. Why would the writer of Chronicles start with the king's lineage going all the way back to Adam? I mean, Adam wasn't a Jew. Abraham, the father of the faithful. The Jews would say to Abraham, to John and to Jesus, we have Abraham as our father, as our patriarch. Abraham was not a Jew. Abraham did not worship as a Jew. Noah was not a Jew. Why would they go all the way back to Adam?
Adam was the first son of God.
Okay, Adam is the original son of God. It is a record. In a sense, we might say he goes all the way back to Adam for the lineage of David, for the same reason that Luke goes all the way back to Adam for the lineage of Jesus. The Jews, Matthew writing to the Jews, that wouldn't have made a particular impression on them, because we have Abraham. Our covenant is based in Abraham. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, down to Moses. That's where their focus was. That's where Matthew goes. But the non-Jewish reader, we're going back to the ideal man. That takes us back to the source, to the wellspring, which would be Adam. Now, look at the book of First Chronicles. Let's just sort of survey through this for a moment or two. We'll take a break in about 10 minutes and take about a 12 or 15 minute break at that point. You look at First Chronicles, you start with Adam. Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah, Shem, Ham, Japheth, the sons of Japheth, and now we start to break it out a little more. We go from Adam to David, and then from David through exile to restoration in the book of 1 Chronicles, chapters 1, 2, and 3. And then you pick up at chapter 4, and what happens there? At the end of chapter 3, the sons of Neriah, Elionai, Hezekiah, Azrikam, 3 of them, the sons of Elionai, Hodaviah, Eliashib, Peliah, Akub, Johanan, Deliah, and Anani, 7. And you pick up in chapter 4, now the sons of Judah. Sons of Judah, all of these. Get down here to verse 24. The sons of Simeon. And then chapter 5, the sons of Reuben and Gad. Half tribe of Manasseh. Chapter 6 is the Levites. Chapter 7, Issachar and all. This carries us through chapter 8. What does this do? This carries us through the period from the establishment of the family, the clan, basically, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob and Esau separate. It takes us from Abraham through Isaac to Jacob, and then down through Jacob's 12 sons. And where do we end up in chapter 8? Chapter 8, the genealogy of King Saul. Well, now, wait a minute. Back up. I thought we already mentioned Saul back here in chapter 1, chapter 2. We did. Oh, by the way, who else do we have in chapter 1? The kings who reigned in the land of Edom, the chiefs of Edom. And we have the other descendants of Abraham, the sons of Isaac and the sons of Esau, the Edomites, the sons of Seir, and so forth. Well, these folks, turns out, guess who they are? The Edomites. Well, they're first cousins to all the Israelites, including the Jews. By the way, let me just pause here for a second and make an observation. You will hear me sometimes make a distinction between the Israelites and the Jews. And that depends on what period of time we're referencing. In this ancient time, when the 12 tribes were still distinct and their lineages were still well known, the term Jew is used in this part of the Bible primarily, not always, but primarily to refer to someone from the tribe of Judah. So in this period of time, all Jews are Israelites, all Jews are Hebrews, but not all Israelites are Jews, because you've got Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Gad, Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, Zebulun. You've got all these other tribes that are Israelites, sons of Israel, but they're not sons of Israel's son, Judah. Now we come down to the New Testament time, or even before then, we get down to the intertestamental period, the era of Ezra, Nehemiah, going down through some of the minor prophets to that 400 years of silence from Malachi to Matthew. During that time, basically from the period of the restoration, 536 BC, Cyrus, king of the Persians, says, okay, all you Jews can go home. What else did he say? You can go home, you can build your temple, you can rebuild your city, I'll underwrite it. But he also said, anyone from the other tribes of Israel that wants to go can go. And apparently a few of them did. You know, no Levite was ever a Jew in the Old Testament. But from the time of the restoration coming forward into the New Testament, what happens? Most of the other tribes in Israel have already been so scattered in the Gentile world that most of them never return to the land of promise when they can. Even most of the tribe of Judah does not return to the land of promise. Before captivity, where did most Jews live in the ancient world? Most Hebrews, let me rephrase that. Most Israelites, most of the 12 tribes, where did they live? They lived in the promised land. They lived in that little stretch of territory that runs from Dan to Beersheba, that's from the anti-Lebanon mountains in the north down to the Negev in the south, about 125, 150 miles long, about 50 miles wide at its widest point, not quite to the Mediterranean coast, and but about 25 or so miles east of the Jordan River. They lived in an area that was about as big as from here to Knoxville, here being south of Atlanta, and about as wide as from here over to the Alabama state line. Most of all the Israelites in the whole world in that one little piece of territory, after captivity, where did they live? They were literally scattered all over the known ancient world. Most Jews, most Israelites after captivity would never, ever live in the promised land again. Even today in the 21st century, people who count themselves as Jews, there are many times more living in the United States, in Europe, in South America, even in Southeast Asia, than there are in what is the modern state of Israel, which is not the ancient nation of Israel. Well, these people, first cousins to the Edomites, descendants of Esau, you would think they started out worshiping the same God. Esau and Jacob didn't get along. Jacob was a sneak and a thief with his mother's help. But 20 years down the road, what has God done for Esau? Yeah, Jacob's been gone for 20 years. He's got 2 wives and 2 concubines, which are junior wives, basically. He's got a dozen kids plus a daughter, a dozen sons plus a daughter, and a lot of heartache. And he's been blessed beyond measure. He starts to come home. What does he discover? God took care of Esau too. Took 20 years, but Esau's desire to bury the hatchet with his brother in his brother's head, that desire has kind of died out. But guess what? Their children never get along. Hundreds of years later, at the destruction of Jerusalem in 586, what are the Edomites, the children of Esau, doing? They're playing catch and release for a bounty on the Israelites that are trying to flee, the Jews that are trying to flee. Instead of giving them aid, helping them escape, they're catching them and handing them over to the Babylonians so they can be sold into slavery. Think about this. There were 3 deportations of Jews from Jerusalem between 606 and 586 BC. 606, Nebuchadnezzar basically takes the sons of the noble families. That's how Daniel winds up in Babylon, because he's a prince. He's of the royal house. So you really don't have all that many people taken away, just the high-ranking officials' children, and that's kind of a blackmail thing to make sure that they behave themselves. 9 years later, 597, now he comes back and scoops up a lot of what we'd consider the upper middle class, and that gets the priests to a large degree, and that includes Ezekiel. But they're not sold into slavery or anything. They're just deported. They're allowed to buy land and vineyards and farms and build houses and work and ply their trade. The only punishment, in a sense, for them, they're not allowed to live in the promised land. They're strangers in a strange land, but they've got the title to their own houses, and they've got prosperous businesses and so forth. 586 is different. When they resist, when Zedekiah resists, and Nebuchadnezzar has to lay siege to Jerusalem, and they fight like maniacs. When he finally conquers Jerusalem, he has had it with these upstart Jews. And everybody they catch at this point, they really do get marched away in chains. And many, if not most of them, really are sold as slaves in Babylon. So you think about it, there's been communication back and forth all these years, 20 odd years of the beginnings of the captivity. Mail service was good. You could get a letter from one side of the empire to the other in less than 3 weeks in those days. Wish you could get a letter from East Coast to West Coast in 3 weeks. But the folks that are settled there in Babylon already, there's cousin Shlomo in a slave caravan in chains, and he's going to be sold. There's my auntie's children who were still there, who were left behind last time. Now they're not going to be allowed to just come and live with me. I'm going to have to buy them, if anything, because they were part of the group that resisted. So their experience was altogether different. So we come down into the Chronicles, and we have this record that emphasizes a lot of these differences and details that are not obvious in the Kings. Now I want to draw your attention to one thing, and then we'll take our break. Look at 1 Chronicles chapter 4 for just a minute. Some of you will remember a book that was really popular several years ago by a fellow named Bruce Wilkinson, The Prayer of Jabez. Well, you find the prayer of Jabez here in 1 Chronicles chapter 4, and the context is verse 10. Well, who's Jabez? Well, number one, Jabez is in the lineage of Judah. He's one of the sons of Judah. Verse 8, Kaz fathered Anub, Zobeba, and the clans of Aharhel, the son of Hiram. Jabez was more honorable than his brothers, and his mother called his name Jabez, saying, because I bore him in pain. She gave him a name that basically means, ouch! But what do we read about him? Jabez called upon the God of Israel, saying, oh, that you would bless me and enlarge my border, and that your hand might be with me, and that you would keep me from harm so that it might not bring me pain. And God granted what he asked. And Wilkinson's whole premise in his book was, pray that prayer and God will prosper you. He convenient, that's the English Standard.
The New King James at the end says that I may not cause pain.
Okay. Different rendering there. Goes back to the Textus Receptus versus the others. But the thing that Wilkinson conveniently leaves out in his thesis is verse 9. What does it say at verse 9? He was more honorable, more righteous. He was a more godly man, in other words. God paid attention to him because he paid attention to God. He didn't just say, bless me and take care of me. He put his money where his mouth was before he ever asked God to bless him. Well, Wilkinson's plan is just, it's interesting reading, but it's built on a faulty premise. Questions or comments? It is 7:14. We need to take a break. Besides, I need to drink water. Yes. Questions, comments, thoughts, observations before we break? Okay, we will resume at 7:30. So, we were talking about 1 Chronicles, and we had been talking about how the 1 Chronicles brings us to the genealogy of Saul in chapter 8. And we get down to the end of chapter 8, Ner, at verse 33, Ner was the father of Kish, Kish, the father of Saul, Saul, the father of Jonathan, Malchishua, Abinadab, and Eshbaal, and the sons of Jonathan, and so on and so forth. We get down to the end of chapter 8. We have come through the lineage of King Saul. Look at where chapter 9 starts. So all Israel was recorded in genealogies, These were written in the books of the kings of Israel, and Judah was taken into exile in Babylon because of their breach of faith. Wait a minute. We were just talking about King Saul, who was the first king of Israel. And now we're talking about going into exile. And as we go through chapter 9, who are we looking at? Judah was taken into exile in Babylon because of their breach of faith, because of their sin. Now the first to dwell again in their possessions, in their cities, were Israel, the priests, the Levites, and the temple servants. And some of the people of Judah, Benjamin, Ephraim, and Manasseh lived in Jerusalem. So we have a few Jews, that is, folks of the tribe of Judah, a few Benjaminites, a few Ephraimites, a few Manassites, and a bunch of Levites that come back from captivity. And the focus in chapter 9 is those families that return from exile. Why do we have this abrupt jump? What has the writer done? Chapters 1 through 8, he has set the stage, basically. Chapter 9, now he addresses his audience in a manner of speaking, the folks for whom these things were originally written. We have the record of all of these families, those who were chosen as gatekeepers and those who were in the villages and so forth, the singers and the heads of the fathers' houses and the Levites. And then you get down to chapter 9, verse 35, and what happens? Here's the genealogy of Saul again. In Gibeon lived the father of Gibeon, Jael, and the name of his wife was Maacah, and his firstborn son was Abdon, then Zur, then Kish, then Baal, and so on and so forth. And we get all the way down to King Saul again. And chapter 10 picks up with the death of King Saul, records the beginning of the era of kings, down to verse 10 and the death of Saul. But notice chapter 10 and verse 10. You look at chapter 10, verse 10, they put his armor after Saul is slain, after Saul takes his own life, actually. They stripped him, took his head, his armor, sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to carry the good news to their idols and to the people. They put his armor in the temple of their gods and fastened his head in the temple of Dagon. But notice what else it says. As we go along in Jabesh Gilead, all who heard Saul, all who heard that the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose and took away the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons and brought them to Jabesh and buried their bones under the oak and fasted 7 days. And you pick up at verse 13, Saul died. Why? For his sin, for his transgression, because he didn't trust, believe in, obey the Lord. And the rest of First Chronicles, from this point on, chronicles the life of David. Oh, wait a minute. We've already seen the life of David in 2 Samuel. Samuel, if he is the inspired penman of 1 and 2 Samuel, there's no reason to suppose that he's not, even though his death is recorded there. If God can inspire him to write future things, that's not a problem. But Samuel records the life of David for us in a firsthand account. Now we're looking back by inspiration at the life of David as it is being assessed in retrospect. When you see something firsthand, what do you focus on? You tend to focus on what you're seeing. Yeah, what your eyes are drawn to. Do you always see all of the implications of what you're watching? No. And so Chronicles, First Chronicles, in rehashing, you might say, the life of David, now is going to draw our attention to implications, to impacts, to things that proceeded from the life of David that maybe were not screamingly obvious to someone who was standing right there seeing them happen, even an inspired writer. And so in chapter 11, we begin with the life of David. All Israel gathered together to David at Hebron. And so we have David ruling over Judah in Hebron for 7.5 years. And then he takes Jerusalem at verse 4. And finally, all of the tribes come around and he rules over the whole nation from Jerusalem for 33 more years, rules a total of actually just a smidge over 40 years. And we have the record of his mighty men. We have the advisors, the warriors, the men that he trusted, the men on whom he had depended from the days when he was being hunted by King Saul, when he was being hated and treated like a traitor, when in fact he was actually being loyal and faithful. Why are these men's names included here? They're not listed out this way in 2 Samuel. They're mentioned, some of them. Why do we have this whole list of these guys?
Well, when I read it, I don't know if it's correct. I was just looking at some of the people he had around him. You know how now they say if you want to know what someone's about, look at the men around them.
Okay,
You know, or they were protective, and some of them were real strong.
you're right. As Sister Cherie was saying, the saying now, look at the people around the man that you're looking at, and you get insight into the man. Well, you look at the men around David. These were his co-warriors. They were, in some cases, his counselors, his advisors. They were a reflection to a large degree of his character. What's David's character? He's hardly a perfect man. He's a man who committed adultery, who committed murder. He's a man who caused a census to be taken, and the penalty for that was thousands of his own people who in their own personal right were innocent, but they were part of the nation that he is the embodiment of. Thousands of them died from the Lord, no less. But what is David's overall character? The man after God's own heart. That's right. He is fundamentally, he's not flawlessly, but he's fundamentally a righteous man. What kind of men surround a man like that? For the most part, righteous men. Now we have some exceptions. Joab. Joab always wanted to be the power behind the throne and was forever playing politics. And David finally tells Solomon, you better watch him and take care of him. Ultimately, he does. But if these are the kinds of men who surround a righteous man, that tells us something about their character. Their names are recorded for the sake of posterity in the book of 1 Chronicles. Number one, because the people there in Jerusalem and Judah, not to mention all of their kinfolks back in what has become Persia at that point. Well, guess what? Some of them are related to these men. They could read this record and they could see, well, that's my grandfather's cousin, or that's my mother's uncle. I'm related to him. That man was one of David's. That was a righteous man. That was a great warrior. That was a great. I have a role model right here in my own family. These men were men deserving of praise. Now, as we go on, we look at David's anointment in chapter 10 and his mighty men listed there, and how they joined David at Ziklag in chapter 12 when he's not even king at this point. He's being hunted. But as we go on, we go through the experiences of David's life. In chapter 13, now we're going to bring the Ark of the Covenant from Kiriath Jearim. What had happened? The Ark of the Covenant was removed. Philistines had captured it because the stupid, foolish, ungodly servants of Saul had allowed it to be out there. It had been taken out into battle like a lucky charm prior to all of these things happening. Now, the Philistines kept it 7 months and decided they couldn't get rid of it quick enough. And so there's rather humorous record in the Bible about that whole event. But all this time, here it sits. So David, let's bring it to Jerusalem. Of course, what's David got in mind? Ultimately, if we're going to bring the tabernacle to Jerusalem, I want to build a temple in Jerusalem. He's not going to be allowed to, but that's what's on his mind, in the back of his mind. And so they start to move it. You look at chapters 13, 14, 15. Here's Uzzah. Uzzah is a priest. Uzzah should have known better. Look at chapter 13 and start at verse 5. David assembled all Israel from the Nile of Egypt to Lebo-Hamath to bring the ark of God from Kiriath Jearim. David and all Israel went up to Baalah, that is to Kiriath Jearim, that belongs to Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord, who sits enthroned above the cherubim. They carried the ark of God on a new cart from the house of Abinadab, and Uzzah and Ahio were driving the cart. Well, who's Uzzah? Uzzah and Ahio are priests. In fact, they're in the lineage of Aaron. And what's their responsibility as priests? That's right. It was not to put it on a cart. They were supposed to know all the law. They were supposed to be the teachers of the law in Israel. These guys, by their heritage and their upbringing and their family background, these should have been the first guys to say, no, hold on, wait a minute. That's the wrong way to do this. Why didn't they? I'll tell you exactly. I don't know. I don't know. But they didn't. They moved it improperly. The oxen stumbled. The ark shuddered. Uzzah, whether he's walking behind it or riding on the cart, puts his hand on it to hold it steady. God smacks him, takes him out right there. He didn't have any business touching the ark. And so what do? They turn aside into the house of Obed-Edom, and they left it there 3 months. And in the meantime, David is angry. Have you ever done something wrong and then been angry, not at yourself for having done something wrong, but angry at the parent who told you not to do that, or at the God who told you not to do that, for telling you not to do that, for taking retribution on you for doing something wrong? When you were a child and you got caught misbehaving and you got a spanking for it, or had to go stand with your nose in a circle on the wall, or whatever, however your parents disciplined you. Were you ever angry at your parents for punishing you for your misbehavior? What child hasn't been? See a very childish David here for a moment. But in the meantime, the Lord blesses the house of Obed-Edom. Now, when we finally do get the ark to Jerusalem in chapter 15, David is the one who appoints the musicians to play the various instruments in connection with giving thanks and with making sacrifices at Gibeon and so forth. And I'll come back to chapter 14 in a minute. But sometimes we get down here to chapters 15 and 16 and the mention of the music and the directing of the music and so forth. And folks will actually try to refer to this and make a case. Well, see, there we ought to use instruments in modern worship because David used instruments in the temple. if you're going to follow that as a precedent, number one, we need a temple, which we don't have, or a tabernacle, which we don't have. But number two, we also need what? Sacrifices and priests and all of the other accoutrements that went with this specific worship. This doesn't speak to that subject as it sometimes is applied. This passage does not reference that at all. Now, come back to chapter 14 for a moment. David's wives and his children. David took more wives in Jerusalem. Well, how many wives did he already have? He married Michal, the daughter of Saul, but then Saul took her away and gave her to Paltiel when he got mad at David. He broke up their marriage, basically. Now, she didn't have any children with Paltiel, apparently. She may not ever have lived with him as a wife, but clearly he was attached to her. When David reclaimed her, he cried and whined and carried on like a weakling. But before all of this, who else has David married? He's got Bathsheba, he's got Abigail, he's got Maacah, he's got a house full of wives and a bunch of kids before he ever gets to this point. Things that God tolerates do not prove that he approves of them. The fact that God tolerated David having a multitude of wives does not invalidate God's original design. If you jump over into the New Testament to Matthew chapter 19, chapter 9, 19, verses 1 through 12, you find the scribes and the Pharisees coming to Jesus, and they demand of him an answer to a question. What's the question? Is it lawful for a man to put away, or we would say to divorce his wife for any reason, for any cause? Now, the backdrop of that is there were two schools of thought among the Jewish scholars, three really, but two main ones. And aside from the fact that in Judah, a woman was not permitted to divorce her husband. A man could divorce his wife, but a wife could not divorce her husband. Aside from that, the two schools of thought basically said, we interpret what Moses said in Deuteronomy chapter 24 about a husband who finds some unseemly thing in his wife. One school of thought says, we recognize that as meaning she's playing around on him. She's immoral. She's unfaithful to him in some way, on some level. The other school of thought said, no. That just means he's found something about her that he doesn't like. We were young and in love, and she was so pretty, and we got married, and she got fat and wrinkled and gray. I don't like that. I'm going to kick her to the curb and get me another one. In Matthew 19, what are the scribes and the Pharisees doing with Jesus? Which side of the fence are you on, Jesus? And what did he do? He went back to the very beginning. Have you not read? And he took them right to Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24 and laid out for them God's ideal, God's standard for marriage. One man married to one woman for life. Now, does death sometimes interfere in that? Are there young widows or young widowers? Yeah, sometimes that happens. Are there spouses who do not keep faith and abandon and adulter, water down their marriages with somebody that doesn't belong there? Yeah, that happens. Deuteronomy 24 addressed the fact that the ancient Hebrews were already misusing their wives in that circumstance. And what Moses did there by inspiration was give some regulation that gave them some protection. The scribes and the Pharisees, after Jesus points them to Genesis 2, well, why did Moses command this? To put her away, to divorce her. And what does Jesus say? He didn't command it. He allowed it because your hearts were hard. Because you were already abusing something God gave you that was intended to be a blessing. Well, what does that have to do with what we're talking about here? David, before he ever came to Jerusalem, had a house full of heartache. Brother Andrew Conley, who worked among Muslim people in Africa, in what was then Tanganyika for many years, living in an area where what we now call Sharia law was being practiced among the Muslim population, made the observation that under Sharia law, a Muslim man is allowed to have, if he can support them, up to 4 wives at a time. And they can rotate the wives in and out. I can divorce this one, bring in a new one, just keep getting rid of the old ones and keep a fresh stable of young fillies, as it were, if they want to. And some of them do that. But he made this observation about the men that actually practiced polygamy. His comment basically was, you want to see the most miserable man on earth? Look at the man that's got 4 wives. Because there is nobody in that man's house who's happy. He's got 4 wives all competing for his attention, all wanting to be the number one, all trying to get ahead of each other, and they don't take it out on each other. They take it out on him. David surely got a taste of that with his wives. So what does he do? He's king in Hebron. He comes to Jerusalem. David took more wives in Jerusalem and fathered more sons and daughters. These are the names of the children born in Jerusalem: Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Elpelet, Noga, Nepeg, Japhia, Elishama, Beeliada, and Eliphalet. He had a whole another house full after he got there. God tolerated. God did not approve. The fact that God does not immediately strike down someone who violates his law does not prove that God approves of what they're doing. I've actually had brothers in the church in years gone by try to justify unfaithfulness to their wives by saying, well, David did, and he was a man after God's own heart, so it can't be that bad. To which all I can say is, you ain't no David, fella.
You were talking about instruments of music,
Yeah.
that God sometimes tolerates things that he doesn't approve of, but he doesn't necessarily approve. And in chapter 15, verse 16, we see where David appoints brethren to be singers accompanied by instruments of music.
Yeah.
Evidently, it wasn't a command from God.
There-
David just decided, I think we're going to put some instruments with these singers.
There is a point to be made there. Now, against that line of the references to 1 Chronicles chapter 15, verse 16, where David was the one who appointed the use of instruments in the worship. And the point being made is David did it, not God. David authorized it, not God. In argument against that, we can make the point, God did accept their worship in subsequent generations with those instruments. However, there was in that day so far as the scriptures indicate, no prohibition. There was no instruction as we have in the New Testament. Here's what you do. It may well be that this is something that God endured, you might say, rather than approved. But even if it's not, even if this is something that God was perfectly fine with, that doesn't touch top, side, nor bottom of what the New Testament tells Christians to do. And you know, we really, really, really need to remind ourselves frequently why we do and say and teach what we do as Christians. There is exactly one reason that we do what we do, that we say, teach what we teach, say what we say, believe what we believe. There is only one reason. Because God authorized it. Don't believe me? Flip over to Hebrews, read about Jesus' lineage, and what do we read? It's evident that our Lord sprang out of Judah, concerning which tribe Moses spake what?
Nothing.
Nothing concerning priests. What's the Hebrews writer talking about? He's our high priest, but he's not a high priest after the order of Aaron. That's where our Mormon friends in their cult get way off track. The Aaronic Levitical priesthood has not been restored or given to Joseph Smith or anybody else. It died in 70 AD. Jesus is our high priest after the order of Melchizedek, who was no Hebrew, no Jew, but he was a priest of God and king of Salem. Melchizedek could not have been a Levitical priest. He wasn't a Levite. Jesus cannot be a Levitical priest. He's not a Levite. And what's the Hebrews writer doing? He's making an argument. He's building his case on the silence of the scriptures. We do what we do. We believe what we believe. We teach what we teach because God authorized it, not because, well, he didn't say not to. You know, in Acts chapter 17, on Mars Hill in Athens, Paul talks about the time of David and all of the others that went before him. When he says the times of ignorance, God overlooked, God winked at, God blinked, so to speak, not in the sense of turning aside. What's Paul saying? There were some things that God tolerated in ancient times. No point in arguing about that. There were things that God tolerated David having a house full of wives and a bunch of children by different mothers. That doesn't mean he approved of it. He tolerated it. In fact, in the matter of Bathsheba, what does he tell David? Not only do you have your wives, you have Saul's wives, you inherited them. And if that wasn't enough, I'd have given you more. I'd have allowed you to have more. That doesn't prove that he approves of it. He would have tolerated that. But instead, what did you do? You went and stole a ewe lamb. You went and stole Bathsheba. The times of ignorance, God overlooked. Now, he doesn't overlook anymore. Now he commands all men everywhere to repent. Well, come back to First Chronicles now. We talked about David's wives and his children and kind of took a little excursion longer than I meant to there. One of the things that stands out in the rest of chapter 14 is that David overwhelms the Philistines. These were people that should have been handled not just years ago, but not just decades ago, but generations ago. And even Saul had not taken care of them. David deals with them here. And while David rules, they're largely subdued. Now we bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, chapters 15 and 16, and the dedication takes place there in chapter 16. And notice the song of thanks that starts at verse 8, give thanks unto the Lord, call upon his name. Again and again and again, the admonition, worship him, thank him, praise him. And then in chapter 17, here is God's response. He makes a covenant with David. Now, David's thought here is, this is not right. I live in a nice house, and the ark of the Lord, the dwelling place of the Lord, metaphorically speaking, is a tent. Well, go back to the book of Exodus and read, beginning at about chapter 30, the details of that tent. That tent was about as long as this building. Not quite as wide, but a whole lot taller. It was a magnificent structure in its own right. And the furnishings were tremendous, overlaid with gold, precious. It was an undertaking to move the tent from place to place, but it was a portable temple. That's what it amounted to. David looks at his house, at the palace that he's inherited or had built, and says, well, I'm living in a permanent house, and the Lord's, effectively speaking, living in a tent. What's wrong with this picture? Well, Nathan, do everything that's in your heart. God is with you. That sounds good to me. I'm God's prophet. I think that's a great idea. Build him a temple. How would you like to be Nathan and have to go back to David and say, you know, when I told you it was a good idea, God told me it's not such a good idea. There were a couple of times in Nathan's life, I don't know that I would have wanted to be him. Advisor to kings? Yeah. Not always a happy role. So in chapter 17, David is informed he is not going to get to build the temple. But what does God give him by way of consolation? He gives him a promise, a covenant, an agreement. I will allow your son to build the temple, and I will establish your kingdom. But look at chapter 17 and verse 6. Here's God's response to this. Sounds like a good idea to me. Did I speak a word with any of the judges of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar? Have I ever asked you? Have I ever commanded you to do this? Weren't we just talking about why we do what we do? That's exactly the point that God is making through Nathan here, making to Nathan. God didn't authorize this. Now, as I said, by way of consolation, I'll let your son do this. And David, look at David's prayer starting at verse 16. Who am I, O Lord God, and what is my house that you brought me thus far? This was a small thing in your eyes. You spoke of your servant's house for a great while to come, showed me the future generations. What more can David say to you for honoring your servant? You know your servant. For your servant's sake, O Lord, according to your own heart, you've done all this greatness in making known all these great things. There is none like you, O Lord, and there is no God besides you, according to all that we have heard with our ears. And who is like your people? And he goes on. David, it tells you a lot about the man that How does he react to this? This was his pet project. And how does he react?
Praise.
Okay. Okay. I'm good with that. You're a fantastic God. Who am I to argue with you? So then we pick up at chapter 18, and we have the incidents of David overwhelming neighboring nations, the Philistines and Moab and various other neighbors. And it tells us a little bit about the territory that David conquers. Look at chapter 18, verse 3. David also defeated Hadad-ezer, king of Zobah-Hamath, as he went to set up his monument at the river, where? Euphrates. Where is the river Euphrates? It's not just east. It's hundreds of miles east. It's way back over there in Babylon, what would become Babylon. Ur of the Chaldees. It's the area north of where Father Abraham had come from originally. What's David doing way, way, way over there? Come back into the 21st century for a minute. Let's talk about this doctrine that we mentioned in the last hour that is the underpinning of so much modern Protestant theology. Dispensational premillennialism, the idea that Jesus has to come physically in the flesh back into this world and rule over the world for 1,000 years from Jerusalem in order to fulfill God's prophecies. What's one of the fundamentals that idea advances to try to make its claim? Well, if you go back to the original statement that God made about what territory Israel would cover, and then you go look at the end of the book of Judges and you see everything that they conquered, well, they didn't get to all the boundaries that God promised them. And so the millennialist basically says, you know what? God hasn't yet fulfilled all of his promises. He still owes them some territory. Well, never mind that Joshua plainly says not one bit of God's promise did he fail to fulfill. The fact of the matter in the book of Judges is that every single tribe fell short of conquering what they could have had. It was on them, not on God. But number two, what happens in the reigns of David and then later Solomon? Not only does Israel rule over and control all of the territory that God had originally promised, they rule a whole lot more. That idea that somehow God owes them territory still, that doesn't even hold a drop of water, much less any substance. So, chapter 19, we have the incident with the Ammonites humiliating some of David's messengers, some of his servants. Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, died. Well, what do we know about Nahash? Apparently, he and David got along. They were far enough away. They weren't an issue, weren't a problem. They may well have been under David's thumb at this point, but he and Nahash got along. And David, verse 2, I will deal kindly with Hanun, the son of Nahash, for his father dealt kindly with me. That goes back to when David was on the run at one point during Saul's reign. So he sends an ambassage, he sends some servants, he sends a gift, he wants to console. And what do the advisors to Hanun, the son of Nahash, do? Oh, they're just here to spy out the land. David has designs on your kingdom. You better not accept them. You better not make nice with David. And so they take them and they shave them and they cut off their garments and they send them packing. They humiliated them. And word comes back. And notice the instruction that's given. When David was told, verse 5, concerning the men, he sent messengers to meet them, for the men were greatly ashamed. They'd been publicly humiliated, and there was no way to hide it. And he said, remain at Jericho until your beards have grown, and then return. Well, let's think about this for a minute. What's Jericho? Jericho is the first city that Israel conquered in the promised land. As the old song says, Joshua fit the battle of Jericho and the walls come tumbling down. It was the city that was dedicated, that was devoted, that was consecrated by the Lord as his portion in the land. And they were not supposed to dwell there or rebuild it or anything. Now, later on, Hiel the Bethelite rebuilt the city of Jericho, and the curse that was placed on the city of Jericho by Joshua was fulfilled in him and the loss of his oldest and youngest sons. But at this point, what's Jericho? Well, from a practical point of view, it's a perfect place for these guys to stay because it's a deserted ruin. It's quiet, it's private. They can stay there in that vicinity and not be in any situation where they'll be exposed to public humiliation. Stay there until your beards have grown and then return. And so now the Ammonites, oops, we goofed that up. So now we need to go hire some mercenaries from Mesopotamia, chariots and horsemen and so forth in big numbers. And it doesn't do them any good. God is on David's side. The Ammonites and the Syrians are defeated in the rest of the chapter. And jump forward then. From this, you have the capture of Rabbah at the beginning of chapter 20 and the Philistine giants, those related to Goliath. Interesting tidbit about the Philistine giants in chapter 20. After this, there arose war with the Philistines at Gezer, verse 4. Well, Gezer's an interesting place in its own right. We'll get down to the reign of King Solomon. And who owns Gezer when Solomon becomes king? It ain't the Philistines, it's the Egyptians. And when Solomon marries Pharaoh's daughter, what's her dowry? City of Gezer. Memory serves me. But there's war there. Sibbecai the Hushathite struck down Sippai, who was one of the descendants of the giants, and the Philistines were subdued. Then there was war again with the Philistines, and Elhanan, the son of Jair, struck down Lami, the brother of Goliath, the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. War again at Gath, and there was a man of great stature who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number, also descended from the giants. And he taunted Israel. Jonathan, the son of Shemaiah, David's brother, struck him down. These were descended from the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. Well, that tells us a little bit about the background, not just of these men, but of Goliath himself. Now, if you remember your high school biology, you may remember talking about dominant and recessive genes. And that's not particularly important to our purpose, but I just want to pass that along just to think about here. In the bearing of children, when you have dominant genes present, they tend to dictate the characteristics that the offspring will have. When you have 2 parents, though, that share the same recessive genes, sometimes those recessive genes get together and they produce a child that reflects those characteristics. The dominant gene in the human genome is not actually 5 fingers and 5 toes. The dominant gene is actually 6. These Philistines, 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot, that's not unheard of. Now, what's happened over the years? The recessive gene, 5 on each appendage, has become not the dominant gene, but the more common gene. That dominant gene has almost been bred out of the human genome. But in the 1500s, an English king named Henry VIII, decided that since his Spanish-born wife, Catherine of Aragon, couldn't seem to bear him a son, and since he didn't know that it was he who was the determining factor whether she'd have sons or daughters, since she couldn't provide him a son, he decided to replace her. And her successor was a young lady named Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn started a fashion trend in the courts of Europe in that her gowns and dresses had the sleeves cut at an angle across the hand. So just the thumb and the first couple of fingers would show when she held her hands at her sides or what have you. There's a reason for that. Anne Boleyn had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. And that was uncommon and considered a deformity because most people didn't. She wanted to conceal that fact. And so she had the sleeves cut to hide that extra pinky finger. Useless bit of trivia that relates to something you read about in the Bible. You can take that. That's free. You can take that for what it's worth. And I'll promise you that will not be on the final. What was it I said when we started? What is history? History is the story of people. And sometimes you run across strange people. Well, come back over here to chapter 21. And in chapter 21, now David does something without asking God's guidance. He does something dumb again. He conducts a census. The interesting thing about 1 Chronicles chapter 21 is that it gives us a detail that the record in 2 Samuel does not give. And the detail is Satan is involved in this. Notice verse 1. Satan stood against Israel and incited David to number or to count his army. Now it's interesting to look at the counting of the army. He details Joab, the commander of the army, to carry this out. Joab is not too keen on this. Joab is a politician and a half, but he's not stupid, and he knows God's on our side. Your Majesty, you ought to let well enough alone. Well, he's not going to let well enough alone because Satan's behind it. Jump down to verse 5. Joab gave the sum of the numbering of the people to David. In all Israel, there were 1,100,000 men who drew the sword, and in Judah, 470,000. And that did not include Levi or Benjamin in the numbering. Joab was a Benjaminite. He didn't count his own men. If there's going to be some blowback from this from God, I'm going to try to exclude my kinfolks. And the Levites don't go out to war anyway, normally. And so we don't need to count them. But look at the total number. Basically 1.6 million military age men. Now that would be age 20 to 50, basically. That's a lot of army. This is not a standing army. They're not all under arms at all times, but that's how many he could put into the field when he had to. That's a huge, huge number. It's Satan who incites the census, and chapters 22 through 28 then, before we get to chapters 22 through 28, where he's going to give instructions to Solomon, now we have to deal with the blowback, the consequences of David's numbering. Get down to verse 14 in chapter 21. After God has confronted David, I'm not happy about this. You pick what I'm going to do to you. 3 choices. Do you want 3 years of famine? 3 years of women and children starving because I counted the soldiers? How about 3 months of being devastated by your enemies? Being just 3 months of losing battles. You know, that could cost a king his throne. Because what's that going to do? That's going to lose territory. That's going to bring casualties. Women and children are going to suffer because of that. What's behind the third door? 3 days of pestilence. 3 days of the sword of the Lord. Oops. I really messed up. I'm Lord, you choose. You choose. So the Lord sent a pestilence on Israel, 70,000. We're going to pare this down from 1.57 million to 1.5 even. 70,000 men of Israel fell. God brought the angel to Jerusalem to destroy it, but as he was about to destroy it, the Lord saw and he relented from calamity. He said to the angel working destruction, "It's enough, stay your hand." And the angel of the Lord was standing by the threshing floor of Ornan, the Jebusite. Over in 2 Samuel, he's known as Araunah. Different names, same guy. Here is where David buys the threshing floor, buys the livestock, buys the implements, and offers sacrifice to God for having stopped the plague. You begin then at chapter 22. And here is where we're getting ready for Solomon. And I know our time is about up, so we'll just sort of skim over this. David is preparing everything at this point. How old is David when we get to this point? David's going to live 70 years. Solomon would have been born sometime between age, maybe at the very earliest, late 40s and early 50s for David. Because Solomon is a young man, maybe 20 years old when David dies. David, at this point, is reaching the point in life where his own soldiers, where his own mighty men are saying, you don't go out to battle anymore. You stay here. You got too many miles on you. You stay here and we'll protect you. He's getting older. And as we'll see, he's beginning to be aware of it, because now he's making plans. He sets up to provide the materials for the temple, the skillful workmen. Solomon is charged to build the temple. So at this point now, between chapter 22, verse 2 and chapter 22, verse 6, we don't know how many years pass. Or this may all take place late in David's life. He may already be up in his late 60s. Certainly at verse 6, he is in his late 60s, because he's talking to Solomon as an adult, or as an almost adult, and saying, here's what I want you to do. Here's what I've planned for you to do. Here's what the Lord has promised. Now you do this. You do this, do this, do this, do this, and the Lord will be with you and you'll succeed. And he commanded, look at verse 17, commanded all the leaders of Israel to help Solomon his son, saying, is not the Lord your God with you? Has he not given you peace on every side? And reminds them of all that has been accomplished, not by himself, but by God working through him. Then we're going to organize the Levites for their responsibilities in the temple that will come, and organize the priests in chapter 24 under the descendants of Eleazar and Ithamar, who were the original priests after Aaron. The musicians in chapter 25, the gatekeepers in chapter 26, and other officials. And then you get to chapter 27, and now we're dealing with the military. What's he doing in these chapters? Now, the inspired writer, writing these things for the benefit of people who no longer have a reigning human king, because this is after the exile, after the restoration. What he's doing for them is providing detail, reminding them all of the tribe of Judah are what? They're the royal house. In one way or another, they're all related to the lineage of the king, but they don't have a ruling king. But what does this do? This gives them a record as they come back from captivity, as they are in the process of rebuilding the temple, rebuilding the city, reestablishing, reinstituting the nation and everything associated with it. It gives them a blueprint, in a manner of speaking, for how to restore their society. Because it was David who indelibly stamped their national identity with the things that he did and the way he arranged things. So now Ezra, or whoever is writing this, recording these things, is providing for them a blueprint to put the pieces back together in the period of the restoration. Now we come down here to chapter 28, and David gives commandment to all of Israel. This is bringing us to the end of David's life. And of course, from the perspective of the people reading this in the first generation that had it, from the perspective of the inspired writer, when did these things take place? Well, this is ancient history. This is longer ago for them than our nation is old. This is far enough back that if we compared this from, if we say, okay, in the 21st century, if this was Ezra writing about our history, he'd be talking about colonial times and maybe even pre-colonial times in some respects. 400 years ago, 300 years ago. How do we put all this back together? Here's how you do it. Here's what David established. Here's, in many ways, the essence of what makes us who we are as Jews. So, chapter 28, David's instruction, his charge to Solomon, his details. Now, look down at chapter 28 and verse 19. I just want to note here, David gives all these detailed instructions for the temple that, from his perspective, has yet to be built. From the perspective of the reader, that's the temple that Nebuchadnezzar's army destroyed. And at verse 19, David tells Solomon about all these details. All this he made clear to me in writing from the hand of the Lord, all the work to be done according to the plan. Go back to Exodus chapter 25 and verse 9. And what instruction does God give to Moses concerning the building of the tabernacle? Make sure you follow the blueprint. Jump forward to Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 5. And what does the inspired writer there, appealing back to Exodus 25 and verse 9, say to Christians about Christianity? Do just what God told Moses. Follow the pattern. Follow the blueprint. What is the inspired writer of Chronicles doing for his people who, when they come back from captivity, have not had a temple for 70 years and aren't going to have a functioning temple for another basically 20 years at least? Here's the pattern so that you can put this right. Here's where you start to put it all back together. Well, chapter 29 details the offerings that were made for the temple and so forth, and brings us then to the death of David. And that's where we'll stop tonight. Next week, we'll talk about Solomon in 2 Chronicles and in 1 Kings. We'll go back and forth. And then the following week, we will begin with the divided kingdom. Notice in the syllabus, if you're taking the class for credit, you have some topics mentioned for research papers. If you have an idea for one, feel free to propose it and I'll take it under advisement. I need to know what your choice is by week 4 of the class. So you've got a little time to think and make up your mind. And that research paper will be due 2 weeks before the last class. So 13 weeks to get it done. Questions, comments, thoughts, observations, complaints? This has been recorded. I will put it on a YouTube page and send all of you a link to it in the next 36 hours or so. Michael?
Just on the syllabus, just so we can, I can be ahead.
Yes.
We got on the 10th, what we did tonight, but, so we're gonna do 14 to 2011, with the 17th.
I will take what's in the syllabus in the order it appears. I got ahead of myself tonight, which is a great blessing because I will get behind myself next week.
Okay. I just want to make sure that I'm prepared for what's happening. Okay.
Yeah. We're good.
Okay.
I am also teaching this class at Piedmont Road, which began a month ago. And I already know where I'm going to get behind. I actually managed to get ahead of myself tonight, which I didn't expect, but I'll be behind by the end of next week.
Hi, Brother Rogers, can you email me that syllabus, please? I didn't get an email with that.
Yes, ma'am. Who am I talking to?
Karina Sylvester.
Okay, I will do that, Sister Sylvester. I saw you come in. I didn't know you were going to be in the class, but I will take care of that. Also, whose phone number is 494-513-0977? I don't know who that is.